Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the plenary talk by Professor Rajat Mittal. Professor Rajat Mittal doesn't need much introduction, but I would anyway just briefly introduce him. The title of Professor Rajat Mittal's talk is Immersed Boundary Method, Translating Concepts into Simulations. He's a pioneer who has been working on immersed boundary methods and computational methods in fluid flow for a long time now. And just to give a bio about the speaker, Professor Mittal is a professor of mechanical engineering at the Johns Hopkins University with a secondary appointment in the School of Medicine. So he received his BTech degree from IIT Kanpur in 1989, the MS in aerospace engineering from the University of Florida, and the PhD in applied mechanics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1995. His research interests include fluid mechanics, computing, biomedical engineering, biofluids, and flow control. He is the recipient of the 1996 Frankel Award from, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, award from the Division of Fluid Dynamics of the American Physical Society, and the 2006 Louis Moody Award, as well as the 2021 Freeman Scholar Awards from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. He is a fellow of ASME and APS and an associate fellow of the AIAA. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Computational Physics, Frontiers of Computational Physiology and Medicine, and the Journal of Experimental Biology, and on the editorial boards of the International Journal for Numerical Methods in Biomedical Engineering and Fluids. So, this introduction, I would now request Professor Mittal to take the floor and continue with this presentation. So, we are able to see your presentation slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Arvind, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here to give this talk. I wish, of course, that I could be there in person, but this is something that all of us are, having to deal with over the last few years. Is this bizarre kind of existence of online meetings and Zoom meetings? But anyway, looking forward to telling you a little bit more about some of the work that's been kind of a dominant feature in my research career over the last 20 years, which is immersed boundary methods. And I really have designed this talk for the students, of fluid mechanics, heat transfer, computational mechanics who are attending this conference. And the idea of this talk is to really try to show you all what an incredible tool immersed boundary methods has been for us and what it can be for anybody who is getting into the field of computational fluid mechanics and heat transfer. So that's basically going to be the whole emphasis of the talk. So as with everything else, my entry into immersed boundary methods was of course driven by a bunch of research questions. So I'll lay out some of the research questions that have been a motivating factor for our research over the last, I would say, decade or a decade and a half. And a lot of my work in these last 15 years has been in the realm of biofluid mechanics. And biofluid mechanics, you can, there are two major areas. You can talk about biomedical engineering and biophysiological fluid dynamics, and biological locomotion, which is the movement of animals, swimming and flying of animals. So those are, in fact, all the areas that have been part and parcel of the research that I've done over the last 15 years. So one question that we attempted to answer over the last 10 years was, you're looking at this very nice video that was taken by my collaborator, Ty Hedrick at UNC Chapel Hill. And you see here a moth, which is flapping and hovering in front of a flower. And this moth is hit by a vortex ring. And this experiment was designed to try and understand how insects that use flapping wings, how do they stabilize their flight? It turns out that insects are not open loop stable. They're actually open loop unstable. And we were trying to figure out, using experiments and computational modeling, how these insects stabilize themselves. A more recent project that we are working on is regarding bats in flight. So you're seeing here a bat, a very nice video taken by my collaborator, Dimitri Skandalis. And it turns out that bats, on the top of their wings, they have these small hairs, and these hairs actually cover the entire wing in different locations. And it's well understood that these hairs allow the bat to sense flow separation. And as the flow separates over the wing, the hairs actually provide feedback. And so we are in a project where we are trying to understand how does the bat use the hair, and what kind of sensitivity does the hair provide to the bat to sense different degrees of flow separation over the wing. Then a lot of our work over the last 15 years has been in the area of cardiovascular fluid dynamics. In fact, I will take a lot of time today to talk about one of the projects that we have done on cardiovascular flows. Here, what you're seeing here is the heart of a patient. And this is a patient with a fundamental problem with their heart valves. Their heart valves, these fluttering leaflets that you see, in this particular patient, they are very long. They are longer than are typical. And this makes these patients susceptible to all kinds of disease conditions. But more particularly, we are interested in understanding why some heart patients are more susceptible to the formation of blood clots. Blood clots can be very serious if they form in the cardiovascular system. And this was a project that we worked with a bunch of, group of cardiologists here at Johns Hopkins to try and answer this question. A question more along the lines of kind of aerospace aeronautical engineering is a project that we are working on for the Army currently, which is we are trying to understand why drones such as this quadcopter drone, why are these drones so noisy? As all of you know, if you've seen a drone, you've heard a drone, even these small drones can make a lot of noise, and this noise can make them somewhat inappropriate for certain applications. So we are trying to understand, what makes these drones noisy, where is the aeroacoustic noise source for these drones, and how we can redesign these drones to make them quieter. And then finally, a question that is more relevant to this particular audience, which has to do with heat transfer, and I'll talk about this at length, is that can we use fluid structure interaction as a way to enhance heat transfer in laminar flow type of heat exchangers? So the common thread in all these problems, all these questions, all these problems is that we need to, if we're going to address them using computational fluid dynamics, then we need to simulate flows with very complex geometries, with moving boundaries, fluid structure interaction. Oftentimes, we have to go from imaging to simulation. So we need to figure out how to go from imaging to simulation very rapidly. And then many of these flows include other physical effects such as acoustics, electromechanics, chemistry, etc. And then, of course, when we want to do all these simulations, we want to do them fast enough so that we can get some good answers quickly. So the conventional way of simulating this, at least 20 years ago, used to be by using body conformal grid methods. And these are either structured grid methods, which are single block or multi-block, or they could be unstructured grid methods. And I'm showing you here examples from some of the work that's been done on moving boundaries, insect flight, etc., using these body conformal grids. And as any practitioner of CFD will know, body conformal grids is basically you form grids that conform to the shape of the boundary. And this methodology has a lot of advantages. First of all, the application of boundary conditions is very simple. And you can generate optimal meshes for a given configuration if you work hard enough and you have a good mesh generator. And you can also provide resolution near boundary layers, etc., in a very, very precise manner. But of course, this has a lot of disadvantages, and disadvantages really come out when you talk about moving boundaries and fluid structure interaction, etc., is that the mesh generation process can be very resource consuming. And as you can see in this bending beam problem, as the beam bends, the mesh has to be regenerated at every time step. So basically, you need an automated mesh generation procedure. You need time evolving meshes, etc., etc., and that can make this extremely complicated. And all of this interpolation and going between different meshes can also introduce errors. So bottom line is that you require a very complex computational infrastructure if you're going to use a body conformal grid method. And because of this, simulations of insect flight and these complex fluid structure interaction problems have kind of been outside the capability level of most researchers because this infrastructure is so complicated. In contrast, body non-conformal grid methods, which we also can call them immersed boundary methods, basically perform all their simulations on Cartesian grids. This is one of our simulations of a mosquito in flight. And the mesh is a Cartesian mesh. It's a single block Cartesian mesh. And the mesh is stationary. It does not move even though the wings are flapping and the body is moving. The mesh is stationary. The advantage of this is that basically we can very rapidly perform simulations because the mesh is so simple and the body movement of the boundary is not affecting the mesh. So we can actually go very quickly from ideas and concepts to simulations if we use these immersed boundary type of methods. Of course, these methods do not have, they do have their weaknesses and disadvantages. One of the things is that, of course, if you have a mesh that does not conform to the boundary, then you need special techniques to apply boundary conditions to maintain accuracy and conservation, and also difficult to provide enhanced resolution only in certain localized areas. And in a very early immersed paper, annual review paper on this, we had also shown that the grid size increases very rapidly with Reynolds number for these types of methods unless you use some local refinement techniques. So those are some of the disadvantages. And in the last 20 years, my group as well as other groups have been working on trying to kind of basically eliminate or diminish these disadvantages. So these methods can be made more and more widely applicable to a wide variety of problems. So just to kind of show you a little bit about the history of these methods, and I thought, again, both the students and the practitioners would enjoy this kind of a little bit of a history lesson on immersed boundary methods. So the history of immersed boundary methods actually goes back to the very first, to kind of the very initiation of computational fluid dynamics itself. So around the 1950s is when the first supercomputers started to arrive in various national labs here in the US and other places in Europe and Japan. And very quickly after that, the first few simulations of fluid dynamics started to happen. In fact, the first, 1957 is when the particle in cell method came out. And the particle in cell method is kind of a Cartesian grid-based interfacial flow simulation method. It uses Cartesian meshes, but is able to kind of simulate flows with complex interfaces. So in some sense, it's a little bit of a precursor to the immersed boundary methods. But then the real kind of what we consider to be immersed boundary method really emerged in the 1960s and 70s. I would call out here some interesting work by Hirota and Miyakoda in 1964, where they solved vortex shedding past cylinder using an immersed boundary, Cartesian immersed boundary method. The marker and cell method of Welch, Harlow and Welch, very famous method for doing interfacial flows, appeared in 1965. And then in late 1960s, Vicelli from Los Alamos National Labs also presented a Cartesian grid method to solve flows with complex curvilinear boundaries. But the real the real revolution in immersed boundary methods and what is really considered to be the starting point of immersed boundary methods was this very amazing PhD thesis by Charles Peskin. He wrote this thesis in 1971, and this is where the basic idea behind immersed boundary methods, what we call diffuse interface immersed boundary methods, was introduced. So this was a very, very productive time for computational fluid dynamics with Peskin's immersed boundary method. The ALE method came out around the same time, and the first use of finite element methods to do fluid flow also came about. And then, of course, after that, there was a bunch of other researchers and research groups that brought in Cartesian grid method for inviscid flows, for compressible flows, and also the cut cell method was introduced by Hassan in 1986. So this is kind of some of the early history of immersed boundary methods. But again, the method of Peskin is the key method that really started this whole field. And the way this method works is quite different. And I'll kind of I'll skip over some of these details, but the bottom line is that the way this method works is that it introduces discrete forces at the boundary of the immersed body. So if you have a solid immersed body, I'm showing here on this figure, if you have a solid immersed body, let's say, the idea is you apply boundary conditions by adding a force, a discrete, a very localized force on this body. The problem with this is that, of course, on a finite mesh, the discrete force cannot be supported in a given location. So this force is actually diffused out, and you end up getting a more diffuse version of the immersed body. So that's kind of the primary disadvantage of this Peskin's the diffuse interface method, is that the boundary kind of gets diffused over a few grid cells. So you don't get a very sharp representation of the boundary. But of course, this method has a significant advantages. The biggest advantage in my view is that it's very easy to implement in any code. So you can start with any CFD code, and literally you can implement this method within, you can write a small subroutine and you can implement the Peskin's immersed boundary method fairly easily. So this method has really made immersed boundary methods kind of available to a very large community. In contrast to the Peskin's immersed boundary method, there is what we call the discrete forcing approach. And the whole idea here is that in Peskin's immersed boundary method, I just kind of skip back, you have the Navier-Stokes equations and you add a forcing to the continuous Navier-Stokes equations, and then you discretize the problem. But in discrete forcing methods, you discretize the Navier-Stokes first, and you can discretize it using your finite difference method or a spectral method or a finite element method. And then you make some modifications either in the stencil or in the add a discrete forcing on the right-hand side of the discretized equation. Either way, you end up with what is called a discrete forcing approach. And if you do things properly, you can end up with a very sharp representation of the immersed boundary. So unlike kind of a diffuse interface method, the discrete forcing method allows you to obtain a sharp interface representation. And I'll show you some of the results, because we use this discrete forcing approach. In fact, we use this what is called the DF1 approach, which is the stencil modification approach. And this allows us to obtain a sharp representation of the immersed boundary. Again, I would credit Hirota and Miyakoda, who actually applied this approach back in 1964. So this is not a brand new idea. This idea kind of goes back almost 50 years. But hopefully what I'll be able to show you is the advancements and the applications of this method to some very complex problems. I'm going to skip this little bit of a history lesson and continue with telling you a little bit more details about all immersed boundary methods. So immersed boundary methods, the biggest kind of issue is how do you apply the boundary condition at the immersed boundary and do it with adequate accuracy as well as conservation, discrete conservation. And when we say adequate accuracy, anything better than second order accurate is considered good enough. Second order accurate code, which is locally and globally second order accurate, can give you very, very good results. This has been shown again and again. In fact, the vast majority of commercial codes and even research quality codes, finite difference or finite element, tend to be at most second order accurate. So that's a very good aim to shoot for. The other problem with immersed boundary methods is conservation, discrete conservation. One needs to design these methods so that they are discretely conservative. And then I also mentioned that you get a very rapid increase in the grid size with Reynolds number, because if you use a single block mesh, and let's say you have an immersed body, then you need to kind of pack a lot of grid points around the immersed body, and these points actually extend off to infinity and to the other parts of the domain. So the solution to this is local refinement, some kind of a local refinement or nested grids. And this is something that we have worked on and a number of other groups have also worked on to try and overcome this limitation of the immersed boundary method. So with that, I'm going to transition to talking about the method that we have been developing. We call this method, the code is called VICAR 3D. It's a viscous Cartesian grid solver for 3D immersed boundaries. It can solve for stationary and moving boundaries. It can solve, it is a sharp interface method. It uses a second order fractional step scheme for time advancement, a second order non-dissipative central difference scheme for the spatial discretization, and we can run it using in either the DNS or the large eddy simulation mode. So both are available. It's fully parallelized. A version of this use CPU and GPU, but we are mostly using a CPU MPI type of programming for this parallelization. And this code can handle very, very large simulations. We have recently completed simulations with over 100 million mesh points with moving and deforming bodies. The way it works is that any immersed body is represented in terms of a triangulated mesh, and that triangulated mesh is immersed inside a Cartesian mesh, and that is how the simulations are done. We can do compressible flow, incompressible flow, acoustics, convection, diffusion, reaction, fluid structure interaction, and also there's some limited capabilities for introducing active materials into the code. Like I said, it's been parallelized and it's fairly efficient, and there are a number of papers that have described the various details of this code. If anybody's interested, they can find these papers on our website. So now with this, I'm going to transition to talking about two applications. The first application is related to cardiovascular flows. I know that this is a conference on heat transfer, so biological fluid dynamics is not necessarily central to the subject matter of this conference, but I still thought that this is something that all of us health is the biomedical engineering and the science behind health is something that is relevant to all of us. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this first project. The second one is more closer to the subject matter of this conference, and this is a project that we did for we worked with experimentalists on this collaborative project where we're trying to use flow-induced. We are trying to enhance heat transfer using flow-induced flutter. So these are the two projects that I'll focus on in the next 15-20 minutes. So a little bit of introduction on this project on cardiovascular fluid mechanics. So what I'm showing you here is a simulation, a direct numerical simulation, very, very accurate direct numerical simulation that we did back about 5 years ago of the flow inside the left ventricle of the heart. So this chamber that you're seeing here is the left ventricle of the heart, and you can see that the flow comes in and then it goes out. So that's what's happening as the heart is pumping, it brings fluid in and pushes fluid out. So it brings in the fluid from the lungs and pushes out the fluid to the body. So that's the function of the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is the workhorse of the heart. This is the part of the heart that does all the work. A significant amount of pumping is actually being accomplished by the left ventricle. And this left ventricle is a positive displacement pump. So that's the, in engineering terminology, this is a positive displacement pump. And the heart kind of expands and contracts. And the degree of expansion and contraction is measured by something called the ejection fraction, EF. And a typical healthy heart has an ejection fraction of about 55%. So what that means is that 55% of the volume of the heart, of the left ventricle, is ejected in every cardiac cycle. So in every cycle, approximately 55% of the heart, the blood volume is ejected out. And you can see this ejected out volume in the aorta of the heart. So this is all the flow that's coming out. And by the way, what we're showing here is the vorticity, the vortices using the Q criteria. And you can see that the flow inside the heart is very transitional, fairly turbulent actually. The Reynolds numbers in the adult human heart are about 5,000 or so. And at those Reynolds numbers, you can get a fairly turbulent flow inside the heart. So the issue here is that, as we all know, that if a blood is left to be stagnant, it coagulates very quickly, it clots very quickly. So the question is that clots can be very, very dangerous for the body. And if the heart starts to actually somehow be damaged, if the heart is damaged due to myocardial infarction, for instance, let's say a heart attack, or heart failure, or arrhythmias, or any kind of other diseases, then typically what will happen is that this ejection fraction reduces, the heart pumps slower and slower, and because of that, you end up getting stagnant flow inside the heart. And because of stagnation, you end up getting a patient might end up getting a blood clot that might form inside the heart. And we're showing here patients with a blood clot. And blood clots are made up of platelets and fibrin and other biomolecules. The problem with these blood clots is that if small pieces of these blood clots break off and they travel downstream, then they can basically go and they can embolize another artery. They can block an artery and lead to a stroke or to a myocardial infarction. So that's the problem with this, with the formation of blood clots. So it is very, very important for a cardiologist who is treating a patient to make sure that a patient does not form blood clots. And the way in which a cardiologist decides whether a patient is high risk of blood clot formation or not is by looking at this one number called EF, which is the ejection fraction. If the ejection fraction is less than 30%, then most of the time the cardiologist will think that the patient is high risk of blood clot formation. And once that patient is considered high risk, they are put on a very aggressive regimen of antithrombotic medical therapy, which is basically a bunch of drugs, anticoagulants, antiplatelets, and blood thinners. However, it turns out that it's well known that ejection fraction is a poor predictor of LVT risk. So here, what we did was we took 75 patients from Johns Hopkins Hospital, 25 patients in 3 cohorts, 25 patients who had normal ejection fraction. So this is the normal group, and their ejection fraction is on average about 60%. And then 2 groups of patients, both of whom had low ejection fractions. So ejection fractions for average ejection fractions for both these groups are less than 30%, but one half of this group had left ventricular thrombosis, which is blood clots in their left ventricle. So that's the LVT group. And the other group did not have left ventricular thrombosis. So basically what we are showing here is that if we just use ejection fraction as a way to stratify risk, then all of these patients would be considered high risk of thrombus formation, except that only half of them form the left ventricular thrombosis. So this is a very good proof that ejection fraction itself, by itself, cannot discriminate between these 2 groups. So when we started working with the cardiologists, they basically gave us the task that can you use computational modeling to come up with a better metric, better than EF, ejection fraction, for stratifying the risk of left ventricular thrombosis formation. So here is what we did. We basically created a whole pipeline that went from imaging of the left ventricle of patient hearts, incorporated computational fluid dynamics, but we also incorporated coagulation chemistry. So there is the whole chemistry of coagulation, which involves a lot of biochemistry. And we managed to simplify that into a set of convection diffusion reaction equations. And so we are able to solve not only for the fluid flow, but also the biochemistry of coagulation. And then what we did was we applied this to a sequence of data sets from patients. So this is one of the patients for whom who was considered high risk. So what you're seeing here is the flow coming in from the mitral valve, and then the flow going out into the aorta. And you can see the vorticity, you can see the blood cells circulating inside the left ventricle. But more importantly, you can also see these isosurfaces of thrombin. And thrombin is one of the molecules, one of the chemical molecules that is produced, which tells you whether a person is high risk of thrombus formation or not. And what this coupled simulation is telling us is that the thrombus in this patient, if it were to form, would form probably in this area of the left ventricle or this area of the left ventricle. All right. So basically our simulation is not only telling us something about the fluid dynamics, but it's also starting to tell us something about the chemistry of coagulation and the risk of coagulation. What we found was that in the end, it's the fluid dynamics that's driving everything. As you can see, note that the jet that is coming in from the left ventricle in this patient never reaches the apex of the ventricle. It just comes halfway down and it doesn't reach the apex. And so it turns out that that fluid dynamics is the key part of this thrombus risk. The chemistry actually doesn't matter. The chemistry, so here's a plot of something that we call near wall residence time, which basically estimates how much flow is getting close to the wall of the ventricle. And this is the thrombin concentration. And we see a very nice correlation between these for the various cases that we simulated. So it turns out from these simulations, we determined that the fluid mechanics is the most important part. The chemistry is not that particularly important. So based on these simulations, then we were able to come up with a new metric. And basically the metric is as follows, is that you notice that the jet that's coming in, it does, in this particular patient, the jet does not reach the apex. So the apex actually has a lot of stagnant flow in this case. If this was a healthy heart, this jet would reach all the way to the apex and it would clean out the apex and create a lot of mixing and a lot of sweeping kind of flow that would remove and wash out the fluid from the apex. So when we looked at these kinds of simulations and the results from these simulations, it dawned on us that a very simple metric would be the length of this jet divided by the length of the ventricle. If the length of the jet is longer than the length of the ventricle, then we get good washout. If it is less than the length of the ventricle, then we have poor washout. So basically the ratio of the jet length to the LV length would be a very good metric. And the question is, can we get both of these quantities from measurements from patients? And it turns out we can. The length of the LV is something that is obtained in almost every examination of a patient that has heart issues. So the LV length is available, and the jet length can also be obtained by using an echocardiogram. So this is an echocardiogram of a patient, and basically there is something called the velocity time integral that is obtained from these echocardiograms. And the velocity time integral, in fact, you can show that it is an estimate of the length of the jet. So basically all we had to do was take two available quantities, the velocity time integral, which is available from echocardiogram, and also the length of the LV, which is also available from imaging. Take the ratio of the two, and that we call the E-wave propagation index. If this index is greater than 1, then we have very good washout of the ventricle apex, and the person would be low risk. If the EPI, this E-wave propagation, is less than 1, then we would have incomplete washout, and we would have high risk of thrombus formation. So that is kind of the result from the simulations and our analysis. Now the question was, how well does this work for actual patients? So again, this is the same data set of 75 patients. And if you recall, the original way of measuring risk is to see whether the patient has an ejection fraction less than 30%. And based on that, all of these patients would be considered high risk. We took all of these 75 patients and we computed the EPI for these patients by going to the database and extracting all this information. And this is what comes out when we apply the E-wave propagation index to the same set of patients. So amazingly, we were very, very pleased and excited to see that the E-wave propagation index actually provides a much, much better stratification. So notice this LVT group. Every single person in this LVT group of 25 people has an E-wave propagation index that is less than 1, which is kind of what we predicted from our simulations. This CMP group, well, actually the normal group, this is the normal people with normal hearts. Every single one of them had an EPI which was greater than 1. So which is also what we would expect. A normal heart should have an EPI greater than 1. And then this group, which is a group of patients who had compromised hearts but no left ventricular thrombosis, the vast majority of them had an EPI greater than 1. So basically, the E-wave propagation index is a much, much better metric for stratifying the risk of left ventricular thrombus formation in patients. And then more recently, actually, a group from Denmark actually took the EPI and they applied EPI to a cohort of 364 patients. So this is a very, very large study. This is a study that was not done by us. This is done by a completely independent group of cardiologists at University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And what they did was, in this large study, they compared EPI, which is what we had come up with, and the left ventricular ejection fraction. And again, just to kind of point out, this is what is called the receiver operator characteristic curve. This is used to understand the accuracy of a diagnostic procedure. And basically, what is shown is that EPI actually improves the diagnostic accuracy by over 25% over existing methods of stratifying risk. And then very recently, there was an editorial that was published that actually kind of tells cardiologists that maybe EPI is a very good metric that more cardiologists should be using to stratify the risk for their patients. So hopefully with this one example, I've shown students especially how you can go all the way from an idea to simulations to actually coming up with something that potentially can have tremendous impact. In this case, the impact would be on human lives. If EPI is 25% better, maybe it can save 25% more lives and improve the treatment for a vast number of patients around the world who are dealing with health conditions. So that is one application. I'm going to switch now to an application in heat transfer. And this is connected with heat transfer in electronic cooling. And the basic challenge in heat transfer in these low Reynolds number flows is that these flows are laminar and the mixing and heat transfer is very weak. So how do you go about enhancing heat transfer in these laminar flow heat exchangers, but do it in such a way that you don't get a pressure loss? So if you have a channel and you're trying to increase heat transfer from hot walls in this channel, you can introduce a bluff body, for instance, that is going to increase mixing. But if you look at the overall efficiency of heat mixing through some kind of a thermal enhancement factor or some variable like that, it turns out that while you get more heat transfer, you also get increased losses, pressure losses. So overall, the heat transfer efficiency can actually go down. So here I picked up these results from some previous work that's been done. So the basic idea that our team pursued was that can we use flow-induced vibration as a way to enhance heat transfer? So the basic idea is if you can increase mixing without increasing the pressure loss, then you can actually enhance heat transfer and increase efficiency of heat transfer. So the idea was that can we use flow-induced flutter as a way to enhance heat transfer? And this idea really was started by my collaborator, Ari Glazer at Georgia Tech, where he made the observation that flow-induced heat transfer is used to create vortices, etc. Can it be used to enhance heat transfer? And he did experiments where he took these cloth reeds or membranes and he put them in a channel. And when he puts them in a channel, then these cloth reeds start to vibrate and flutter. And if you want to kind of, when he measured the heat transfer, he was able to show that even at Reynolds numbers as low as a few thousand, where the flow is quite laminar, you can actually increase heat transfer by almost 30% by the introduction of these reeds. So when we started working on this project, the objective of our project was to really try to understand the flow physics of these kinds of these coupled problems, and also understand the effect of key parameters and develop new design tools that could address these kinds of flow configurations. So we developed a solver, which is a coupled flow structural thermal solver, which is also again based on our Vicat 3D immersed boundary code. So here we have the incompressible flow solver. We also coupled to it a finite element solver for the structural equations, and then a thermal solver to solve for the heat transfer. And we did a bunch of validation studies for fluid structure interaction and also for the heat transfer. And we showed that, in fact, we can predict both the structural vibration and flutter as well as heat transfer fairly well. So with this, we had the confidence that we could solve this problem. And we started working on this heat transfer problem. So the basic kind of parameters in this problem is you have this kind of a membrane, which is located somewhere inside a channel or a duct. You have flow coming in from the left to right, and the walls of the duct or the channel are hot. So basically we are trying to transfer heat from the channel walls into the flow, and we're trying to convect this heat away. So that's kind of the setup of the problem. The parameters in this problem are the Reynolds number, and we wanted to keep the Reynolds number really low because that's the challenging part. How do we enhance heat transfer when the Reynolds numbers are really, really low and mixing and turbulence is not effective but turbulence is not available as a tool, as a modality to enhance heat transfer. The other key parameters in this problem is the mass, kind of the density or the mass of the flag, and also the reduced flow velocity, which is a measure of the flexibility of the flag. So those are the key parameters in the problem. And so those are the input parameters. The output parameters are the heat flux, the net amount of heat being transmitted through the channel, the net energy loss, kind of the loss of the loss in pressure, which is basically the net loss in mechanical energy, and then also a thermal enhancement factor, which is some kind of a heat transfer efficiency that we derived from previous work back in the 1980s and 1990s, which basically it accounts for not only the increase in the heat transfer, but also any potential increase in the loss of mechanical energy in the device. So basically, this thermal enhancement factor, in some sense, is what we are trying to improve. We are trying to improve this over the baseline by using flow-induced flutter. So I'll show you. I'm reaching kind of the 45 minutes of my talk, so I'm going to start wrapping up here and go a little rapidly. So here is some example results from our simulation. So on the top right, you're seeing here vorticity from this flow-induced flutter of the flag. So flow is coming in from the left to right. And then you're also seeing contours of temperature. So you can see that this flag, as it flutters, it produces a lot of vortices, and the vortices are quite effective in pulling heat away from the hot walls. And this works not only at high Reynolds numbers of about 600, but also as low as Reynolds numbers of about 200 or 100. So you're seeing here the effect, the thermal enhancement factor. So this is that thermal enhancement factor that I was talking about. You are seeing this for 3 different flags of different flexibilities as a function of the Reynolds number. And you can see that once our Reynolds number is above about 200, we start to get some improvement in the thermal enhancement factor. And by the time we get to a Reynolds number of about 800, for some of the flags, we can get almost a 25% increase in the thermal heat transfer efficiency. So increased heat transfer but also at a cost that is such that the thermal enhancement factor is still significantly above 1. So this initial set of simulations was 2-dimensional. They were 2D simulations, but of course the reality is 3D. So we transitioned to 3D problems. So this is the whole model for the structural deformation in 3D. It's a finite element solver for the structural deformation of this membrane. Again, the details are there in published papers. What I would like to do is show you some of the results. So here are some of our results of the 3D membrane in a duct. So this is the heated duct and flow from left to right. And what we are showing here is all the vortices that are created due to the flapping of the duct. And when we look at the thermal enhancement factor, it turns out 3D, we are not as effective as 2D. And that makes sense because in 2D, the vortices are much more stronger vortices that are formed. But overall, notice that again, I'll draw your attention to the thermal enhancement factor here, is that even though we get less heat transfer in 3D, the thermal enhancement factor is actually quite equivalent. It's about 1.2. So it's about a 20% increase in the thermal enhancement factor by using these membranes. So basically in this project, we were able to demonstrate that flow-induced vibration is a potential solution for enhancing heat transfer, especially when the Reynolds numbers are low enough such that turbulence cannot be a modality for increased mixing. In terms of the mechanism, what we were able to show also is that these contours you're seeing on the lower wall, these contours are contours of heat flux. And you can see that there's a lot of heat flux in certain regions. So it turns out that these horseshoe vortex structures that are formed, these horseshoe vortex structures are what basically drive the heat away from the wall and increase the heat transfer. So the basic mechanism of heat transfer in these 3D flows is the formation of these horseshoe-shaped vortex structures. So with that, by the way, we did a whole bunch of design studies. We looked at aspect ratio of these membranes, trying to optimize, trying to see if there is some optimal shape and size of these membranes that can enhance the heat transfer. Bottom line is that we get good thermal enhancement factor for a wide variety of flags, as long as the flags are large enough to produce significant horseshoe-shaped vortices. So we get, for an aspect ratio of 1 as well as an aspect ratio of 1.75, we end up getting fairly good thermal enhancement factor. And also the heat transfer actually is quite good. Although the bigger the flag, you see this yellow curve is the biggest flag, the widest flag. The wider the flag, the more the heat transfer that we can get. So depending on your application, you can choose the size of the flag to either give you a lot of heat transfer at a more increased kind of cost of energy, or you can go with a smaller flag that gives you modest heat transfer increase, but also at a modest energy cost. So with that, I think I'm reaching kind of the end of my time. There's other projects that we have done on harvesting energy from fluttering flags. And again, students interested in this project can actually go to our website. But I'm going to stop right here and kind of really, I hope that with this, I've shown you all the kind of incredible power of immersed boundary methods. These immersed boundary methods really open up tremendous opportunities for exploring new ideas and discovering new flow physics. Back 20 years ago, when myself and my collaborator Uday Kumar, who's professor at the University of Iowa, he and I started developing our first immersed boundary code together. We used to jokingly say that, hey, we want a code where if we have an idea on Friday, we have some results on the Monday. And actually, in some sense, in some degree, we managed to accomplish that. And in addition to Uday Kumar, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people who have been instrumental, mostly my colleagues and my students and postdocs. Professor Janghi So, who's a colleague of mine who works with me on a lot of these projects. Dr. Fadi Najjar, who's a scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Labs. And then a bunch of former students and postdocs who have contributed to our work. And I especially want to acknowledge Professor Rajneesh Bhardwaj, who was a postdoc with me about 10 years ago. He's now a professor at IIT Mumbai, and he has continued to push the boundaries on immersed boundary methods. And he and I just recently wrote an annual review of heat transfer article on the use of immersed boundary methods in thermofluids problems. So if students out there who are interested, keep a lookout. This paper, this annual review of heat transfer paper is going to come out in the next few months or so, which will kind of summarize many of the things that I've spoken about here in this talk. So with that, I'll stop right here, and I hope I've left enough time for questions. I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mittal, for completing your talk, and it was very interesting. And I'm sure there are some questions that are going to come up. So it usually takes about a minute time for the participants, when they type on the portal, and there is a small lag. So it takes a minute for us to get it on the Q&A box on the Zoom link. So before that, yeah, please.
I do see one question.
Yeah, it's just now. So I think Reddy is asking, I'm sorry if this is already mentioned, what kind of enhancement in heat transfer can be seen in the turbulent regime for flow-induced flutter case?
So in terms of turbulent flow, so I guess the question is that what happens if you were to add these flags into a flow that is already naturally turbulent? So we have actually simulated these flows all the way up to a Reynolds number of a few thousand. And there at a few thousand, the channel flow already starts to be a little bit turbulent. And there too, what we see is there is, you can see kind of a noticeable increase in the heat transfer because the flags produce these very large vortices, and the large vortices are very good at entraining fluid away from the walls. So at these high Reynolds numbers, we are able to see heat transfer enhancement, which is still in the 10, 15 to 20% range.
Okay. So on a related note, I have a question for you. So the simulations that you showed with the flow-induced flutter that improves the heat transfer rate. So this is all for laminar flow, right? I mean, whatever you've shown. Am I correct, Professor?
Yes.
So yes. If it were to be turbulent, then what would be the situation? And do you think that how would be the how do you deal with turbulence in your particular solver? So do we have to do a DNS, or can we introduce turbulence models into your immersed boundary method code and do the solution? I'm not sure about how the results are going to turn out to be, but I'm just asking for your idea on how the turbulence can be handled in this case.
Right. So actually, so these simulations that you're seeing on the screen right now, these full 3D simulations, these are actually DNS simulations. So these particular simulations have been done in the DNS mode, but we can also run large eddy simulations with this code. And if you go to very high Reynolds numbers, then of course RANS models might be the way to go. Some kind of unsteady RANS. Steady RANS will not give you a whole lot because you need to model the vibration of the flutter of the membrane itself. But some kind of unsteady RANs, some kind of detached eddy simulation type of modeling. People have tried, research groups have tried all of these different ways of modeling turbulent flows in immersed boundary methods in the presence of moving boundaries. So one would have to go to some of those methods. In our group, we do not do RANs. We solve problems that we can solve using DNS and LES, because that is where the power of our code really kind of shines through.
Yeah. I have another question with your earlier simulation on the LVT and very, very interesting simulation. But I'm just wondering, it's such a complex, the real scenario is so complicated. And you have taken the case where you have a person with an LVT and try to look at how the flow penetrates and reaches the deepest parts of cavities of the heart. But in a realistic situation, how do you really know that, that is the way the heart has to pump in a patient with LVT? What is the kind of the dynamic force on the heart that you put in your simulation? Convince yourself that really simulates the case of a scenario where the person has an LVT, and that is the scenario where the blood flow doesn't reach all the parts of the heart. So is there some validation that you compare it with the imaging or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So you can see here that all of these simulations basically are conducted by taking 4D, which is 4-dimensional, 3D and time resolved cardiac CT information. So you're seeing on the top right, you're seeing actually we did all these simulations for about 12 patient-specific cases, and the imaging is taken, and then using the imaging, we actually derive the movement of the heart from that imaging. So each and every one of these simulations is actually fit to the movement of the heart of that particular patient. So we are not really synthesizing the movement ourselves. The movement is actually directly connected to the actual CT scan for the patient. Now, the second question is, great question. So the movement is derived and everything, but the question is, how do we know that the flow simulation is giving us the right result, right? So two ways of kind of going about this. One is that we got a data set from an in vitro heart, like a model heart from a group in Italy who had done PIV experiments on this model heart. And based on that model heart, we were able to determine what kind of grid resolution, what kind of boundary condition, etc. we need to use in order to be able to match the experimental results. So that was how we kind of designed the entire resolution and the boundary condition for the simulations. The final thing is that for the validation of these particular patients, it turns out that validating for a given patient is very tough because you only have limited amount of information about the flow. So this here, and I didn't get a chance to show this, you see this echocardiographic data that you're seeing here. So this is kind of the peak velocity that, if you put the probe, the echocardiogram probe is at this red circle, it gives you the jet velocity, and this is the jet velocity that you're getting. So what we did was we tried to match this E wave and A wave peak velocities from our simulations and the echocardiographic measurements. So those are all the different ways in which we go about kind of convincing ourselves that our results are actually valid.
Thank you, Professor Mittal. I think we are short of time. There's one more last question that we can take from Professor Prasad Patnaik. So he appreciates that it's a highly enlightening talk. Are the blood flow simulations continuum based, or is blood modeled as a multi-phase, multi-component fluid? How the CFD engineers can contribute to the cardiovascular community? Yeah, so I think a lot of, it's a big question, but you can probably try to give a concise answer.
Yeah, the second part is how can CFD engineers contribute to cardiovascular? Hopefully I've shown you, I'm an aerospace engineer by training. All my degrees are in aerospace engineering. And, when we work in mechanical aerospace engineering, we bring a very, very interesting and very unique mindset to problems in cardiovascular fluid mechanics and generally in biomedical engineering. So I think there's a lot we can contribute, and hopefully my presentation kind of showed you that. There are lots and lots of applications. There are literally hundreds of applications of fluid mechanics in biomedical engineering. So you can take your pick as to what you want to work in. The first part of the question, in blood simulations, we have modeled them as a continuum, but there are groups that are trying to, once you get to very, very small capillaries, then you cannot ignore the fact that the blood is made of cells. So there you have to go into the cellular level type of simulation. But a left ventricle is very big. There's billions and billions of blood cells, a lot of plasma. So there the blood kind of acts more, almost, it definitely acts like a continuum, and it 90% acts like a Newtonian fluid. So we are able to get away with those assumptions.
So thank you so much, Professor Mittal. I think we are coming to the end of the plenary session. And so we once again thank you for your time, especially on a holiday and weekend, and joining us with a very nice and interesting, informative presentation. And with that, we wish you a very happy Christmas vacation ahead and a very happy New Year. And we hopefully will look forward to your talks in the future. And when you are coming to India, please do try to visit IIT Madras, and we'll be very happy to receive you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.